Hi students, welcome to lesson number 8, Approaches to the Study of Peasants. Peasant society or peasantry is a contentious concept in social sciences, particularly in the context of societies like India. Even the social anthropologist and sociologist in India, for whom the study of peasant society is of major interest, are not in agreement about the meaning attached to the concept of peasant society. Although the Indian society traditionally was characterized as a peasant society, the concept of peasant society acquired scholarly attention only in the mid-20th century following the discovery of peasantry by the American and Western anthropologists in response to the rising anthropological interest in the comparative study of the human conditions. A peasant is a pre-industrial agricultural laborer or farmer with limited land ownership, especially one living in the Middle Ages under feudalism and paying rent, tax, fees or services to a landlord. In Europe, three classes of peasants existed: slave, serf and free tenant. Peasants hold title to land either in fee simple or by any of several forms of land tenure, among them socage, quit rent, leasehold and copyhold. Now let us understand who are peasants or what is peasant society. A number of researchers have attempted to establish a definition of this term, but a clear definition has always remained contested. Scholars like Horowitz, Foster, Lewis and Fitchen have used social parameters, while Loprito, Dovring, Srinivas and Klass and the Neoffs shares used cultural ones. This contestation of ideas over definition of peasant is explicitly visible in different approaches to peasant studies by different scholars. As a result, we find studies attempting to explain different aspects of peasant life and culture. A rigorous definition of the peasant is desirable, though it remains elusive. The term peasant literally means a person working on the land with simple tools. Even the entire rural population, including the big landlords and the agricultural laborers, have been treated as peasantry. This treatment does overlook the differences between and among the categories, both in terms of the land holdings, technology, employment of the laborer, etc. Eric Wolf, an authority on peasant struggles, defines them as population that are extensionally involved in cultivation and make autonomous decisions regarding the process of cultivation. His definition leaves out certain categories such as poor and marginal peasantry, including the sharecroppers. Theodore Shunin defines them as consist of small agricultural producers who, with the help of simple equipment and labor of their families, produce mainly for their consumption and for the fulfillment of obligations to the holders of political and economic power. This definition too does not take into account rich and capitalist farmers who try to maximize the profit by way of entering into larger market. Take the peasant to mean a person who undertakes agriculture on his own, working with his own implements and using the labor of his family. This definition, which would be acceptable to Marxists as well insofar as it goes, omits any consideration of the extent of the use of hired labor and control over land. The moment these are considered, the peasants seem to fall apart into different strata. Theodore Shunin defined peasantry as having four essential and interlinked facets: the family farm as the basic multifunctional unit of social organization, land husbandry and usually animal rearing as the main means of livelihood, a specific traditional culture closely linked with the way of life of small rural communities, and multidirectional subjection to powerful outsiders. In addition, Shunin recognized the existence of a number of analytically marginal groups which share with the hardcore of the peasantry most but not all of its major characteristics. According to Robert Redfield, 1941, peasant communities are a kind of folk society that exists on a folk urban continuum which has both geographic and historic dimensions. Cities represent the modern urban end of the continuum and small, isolated, non-agrarian indigenous societies are the extreme traditional folk end, with peasant communities near the traditional end. Redfield saw the history of traditional societies as shaped mainly by the spread of modern features of technology, social organization, family, kinship, values and worldview outward from cities at the urban end of the continuum toward the folk end. In a process of modernization of development, this diffusion of the traits of modernity, especially modern values and worldview, would proceed faster were it not for barriers to their acceptance in the traditional culture. This model became important in programs of applied anthropology that sought to identify and overcome cultural barriers to modernization in peasant communities, which were defined as underdeveloped, that is, as waiting to shed their traditional cultures by becoming fully incorporated into the modern national culture, economy and political system of their nation. This approach to economic, social and political development in peasant communities became important in American applied anthropology during the Cold War as an alternative to socialist and communist paths of development. Peasants form a distinctive group everywhere in the world. A peasant is not the same as a tribal. Unlike a tribal, a peasant is a part of society and is invariably linked with the market. He is a small producer who produces for himself and for others, mostly the local people. On the other hand, a tribal society is a complete society in itself with no links with the mainstream society. They produce what they want. their production is for themselves. A peasant is also not the same as a farmer. A farmer's economy is profit oriented, whereas a peasant's economy is subsistence oriented. A farmer mostly produces for the market. T. Sachin claimed that peasants are rural cultivators employing low levels of traditional technology. Only with modernization we can increase production. They are rural cultivators. They mostly use the manures produced from their livestock. Now let us study the historical approach of peasant studies. From around 500 BC, for almost 500 years, there was an immense acceleration in the process of change which universalized peasant production and also simultaneously created caste divided peasantry. The universalization of peasant farming, we can perhaps suggest two factors of crucial importance. One, the extending use of iron. As time passed, the extraction of metal increased in volume and the resulting cheapness diversified its use. Quantity influenced quality. In time, iron tools would become directly available to the peasant, and that would be the turning point. The first recorded reference to the plough containing the iron point is in the Manusmriti, which may be dated as early as 200 BC, but is probably a little later. But iron ploughshares have been found with the northern black polished ware, the NBP, beginning from 500 BC. The use of horse. The success of the Aryas is ascribed to the possession of the horse and still more the horse-drawn chariot. Compared with all previous weaponry, the chariot was an immensely expensive machine. Its possession implied a pre-existing aristocracy. It is therefore difficult to envision early egalitarian stage within the Rigvedic society, as has sometimes been suggested. The state of agriculture glimpsed through the Rig Veda shows the continuance of the ox-drawn plough, Sira. The technology was still primitive. All the Rigvedic shlokas mention a metal generally thought to mean copper, not iron. Barley was a chief food grain, but rice seems to have begun to be cultivated in the upper Indus basin. Social relation approach of peasant studies. When we study a peasant society, we study it as a community. This community is an arrangement, and this arrangement is a persistent arrangement. Peasant community is a social structure. Anthropologists claim that a peasant society is not a complete society. It is a part society. It is a feudal society. It is a part of a nation state. Peasants have interdependency with others. A peasant village is not a complete system by itself, as it has links with city and town. So, it is essential to know the institutions outside the peasantry to understand the peasant society. Peasants are different from plantation workers who live in more integrated communities, according to Horowitz 1960. He defined communities as significant interaction of members within the bounds. Rejecting the ideas of Foster, Pitt Rivers comments that it is certainly reasonable to assume that in a situation of limited resources and productivity, absence of primogeniture and an expanding population, social structures marked by considerable rivalries will be created. He believes, however, that Foster simply described the conventional rivalries and not the quality of interpersonal relations. Nor does Pitt Rivers think it possible to give an objective description of the traits Foster lists, the cultural approach of peasant studies. Scholars have given importance to studying the relation between culture and peasantry and how cultural approach helps in understanding peasant society. Redfield, while discussing peasant studies, argues that the social position of a person has some influence on the way he will behave. He said the priorities are not only on cognition but also on values, positions, actions, etc. When we are talking about uniformity, we don't ignore diversity. Discussing culture and society, Smith in 1961 suggests that society be reserved for territorially distinct units having their own governmental institutions. Smith holds that the core of culture is in its institutional system. Each institution involves set forms of activity, grouping, rules, ideas and values. He would reserve the concept of cultural pluralism for formal diversity in the basic system of compulsory institutions, the kinship, education, religion and the like. From Smith's point of view, class differences are differences in a single institutional framework and therefore do not constitute cultural pluralism. Cultural difference and social stratification may vary independently. Various cultural groups can be at the same stratification level. Discussing peasant cultural attributes, Loprieto 1961 suggested cross-cultural methods of measuring different personal relationships that establish peasants' view of life. The relationship among peasants is not the same as among the Mexicans and Americans. Mexican peasants keep complaining regarding the dog-eat-dog attitude of American peasants as it does not match their values and standards. He believed that immigration from the Mexican community has changed the attitude of a few Mexican families, but it has caused even more conflict. In this manner, he concluded that peasants are a strongly bound cultural unit rather than a social unit. M. N. Srinivas 1962, while discussing Indian society, argued that peasants are willing to accept new technology. He rejected the idea of conflict between the traditional and modern outlook among the peasants. If he is occasionally unwilling to accept others, this occurs not out of fidgetedness but out of superior knowledge of their probable unfavorable social consequences to himself. The economic approach of peasant studies. Peasant economy is a moral oriented economy, not a profit oriented economy. A peasant is a rural cultivator, a small scale producer whose economy is subsistence in nature. Land and animal husbandry are the main source of livelihoods. The peasant family forms a basic unit of production. Wage labor is not employed. They mostly live hand to mouth. A peasant is a settled agriculturalist engaged in agricultural mode of production. His culture is moved by his agriculture. Agriculture is not a business investment for him to get profit, but his culture. His entire livelihood depends on land. For him, security of his family comes before profit. The production of a peasant's family depends on the labor put in by all family members. In a peasant economy, the land and labor are not variables. Depending on the labor they have, they cultivate their land, critically examining economic and ecological criteria over peasantry with the emphasis on peasant society as part society. Fitchen 1961 found no clear separation of peasant society from the tribal society or urban society. She also suggested that social structures dimensions of peasant society can be ranged as the means of defining peasantry as a society type. It may contain volitional and contractual associations, self-sufficiency, social structure and value, local cohesion and involvement and participation with larger society. The idea of volitional and contractual association was further discussed by Foster in 1961 as a dyadic contract model for the social structure of a Mexican peasant village. The Foster defined dyadic contract as a form of social contract between people of similar or different statuses. The contracts are informal and not sanctioned by law. Foster in 1961 also described peasants as large, the class structured, pre-industrial civilizations with trade, commerce and craft having market disposition towards parts of producers' efforts. Nevertheless, Foster concludes that these traditions of interpersonal relations, outmoded or not, make it difficult to introduce into peasant communities any changes that requires cooperation among the families. Lewis 1959 agrees with Foster's description of the nature of peasant interpersonal relations, but is unhappy about the idea that in spite of all the suspicion and envy among its inhabitants, the peasant community can be considered a functionally successful social form. He believes the success of a social form must be evaluated in terms of its human cost. Now, let us understand the political approach of peasant studies. Marx, in his theory of social transference, tries to know the nature of peasants who are involved in various struggles. He explored the political process of peasantry based on power, authority and conflict. He said peasantry is a community or social entity having some economic interest and political consciousness. Marx, during French Revolution between 1848 and 1850, discusses the political characteristic of peasants. Usually, peasants look at them and enter into revolutionary activities. Napoleon represented the peasant as a class. His Labour Party was the representative of the peasant political party. There was no division of labour among the peasants, nor the scientific techniques of cultivation. They used to exchange their labour within themselves. Major part of their production was consumed by themselves. Marx claimed that the peasant is a class but not emerging as a class. Peasants cannot represent themselves. They need others to represent them. They are a class themselves, not class in themselves. They have no capacity to lead. As a class, their culture, economic condition and way of living is separate from other groups of people. Because of their hostility towards others, they form a separate social class. Marx said peasantry is a subordinate state because they subordinate power. They themselves cannot do it. Peasants always want to have direct contact with leaders, not a mediator. Now, let us sum up. The umbrella term peasant is much used and abused to describe the many rural societies which until recently comprised about half the population of the world. It has become common in recent years to argue about what peasantry means, but in general the term has come to denote an underclass of small rural cultivators from whom a surplus has been extracted, rent in the form of free or cheap labor or product, to underwrite the living standards of a more powerful upper class and the needs of the state.